All right, welcome to a morning after edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com Indiana football postgame wrap-up show. John Alden and Alec Lasley here with you on a Sunday morning. I'm feeling a lot better right now, Alec, than I thought I would be had we done this immediately after the game yesterday afternoon. And we may or may not get into those specifics, but because we're here to talk about what happened with Indiana, Ohio State first and foremost. But the Hoosiers lose 38-15, suffer their first loss on the season. Now 10-1, 7-1 in conference play, and squarely still in the playoff hunt. And again, we'll get to that here in a little bit. But Alec, just give me your initial thoughts on what went down at the Horseshoe yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at how the game started, right? I think everyone was pretty excited, not only the 3-and-out to begin. You go down and score, and not only do you have a lot of momentum, but you look exactly how you kind of thought that they would look every other game, right? And then I think there was just a little bit of that nerve going into this one about exactly how they would show up, and that kind of eliminated all that right there. Not only did the offensive line look great at the start, that was really the key switch, in my opinion, was the front seven for Ohio State defensively and how they really took over the game. And then on the flip side, the front seven for Indiana and their inability to attack Will Howard after it happened almost at the exact same moment of the game where both of those offensive and defensive lines, that momentum totally shifted. After about the second or third possession, I want to say, they're kind of into the first quarter, going into the second, and Indiana was, unable to get any sort of pressure in the backfield. So Will Howard just literally sat back and had all the time in the world to throw. And not only did he do that, but then all those open field tackles that Indiana was making to begin the game, they were missing. And so you get maybe a little 5-yard dump out route for the Ohio State wideouts, and then they would go, 10, 15 yards after the catch because of one or two missed tackles. And then obviously, Curtis Rourke just had absolutely no time to throw the ball. What was clearly the worst performance from the offense all year, but specifically the offensive line and the running backs in the pass protection, and that was just the most concerning part. And that obviously was the main reason why they lost that game, because they couldn't drop back to pass, and they were so one dimensional. And then again, on the flip side, they just couldn't get any pressure at all in that Ohio State backfield.
Another thing that was also a big gut punch, at least especially when we've seen how consistent Indiana's special teams have been all year, giving up 2 touchdowns in that department. And I know one wasn't a direct touchdown, the muff snap or whatever you want to call it, by James Evans. That wasn't directly, it didn't immediately go from a touchdown from that play, but it set up an Ohio State touchdown. And then you have the Caleb Downs punt return. It's a 14-point swing right there. And if you eliminate that, which again, it is part of the game, so you can't completely eliminate it, that the score is a much more respectable 24-15 if you get rid of those special teams touchdowns. So a lot of things not going right for Indiana yesterday. And while you were talking about the offense, I also was thinking about all the drops. And not only this week have we seen some drops from Indiana's receivers that were kind of in pressure situations. We saw that a couple weeks ago whenever they faced Michigan as well, particularly with Elijah Surratt, Mr. Waffle House, who is always open. He may need to stop putting some extra syrup on his waffles if he's going to be open all the time, because, I mean, he's got to start catching balls again, right? That may have been the worst joke I could have made, but I went there. I did just go there. So a lot of things, unfortunately, uncharacteristic of this Indiana football team that we have seen at least over the course of the game this past Saturday. And they'll have one more chance to get back on the right track, of course, when they face Purdue this Saturday in a night game edition in the battle for the Old Oaken Bucket. Of course, you want to clock in a good performance there, because if it wasn't the case already, it is now. Your playoff hopes are on the line, and not that Purdue is an opponent that Indiana should be worried about losing against. You still want to prepare the same way that you have all season long. You don't want to have a bad week of practice and give Purdue any reason to be excited about potentially spoiling your postseason aspirations, because that's if they have anything to play for, it's that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one major part of that game, yesterday that I think they can definitely take away, right, is the compounding kind of small mistakes that Indiana had not made all season, and that's why I think you look at that game, and obviously Ohio State was clearly the better team yesterday, but there were that obviously the botch snap there. Even if they do return that punt for the touchdown, right? If that botch snap doesn't happen, who knows what happens that next possession? If there's a couple of those drops that the IU wideouts don't drop and actually do catch and continue to move that ball, that phantom right false start call.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to cut you off. I meant to bring that up earlier because, and I know this isn't the reason that Indiana lost, of course, right? But from the moment that
Yep.
phantom false start happened, that's when things went off the rails for Indiana and never quite got back on them. And one thing that really bothered me from watching this on TV, they didn't show the
No,
replay to
at
see if
all.
James Bamba moved at all. And the broadcast team just kind of moved on from it.
Yeah.
And there have been a few instances previously where Ohio State had penalties where they were, commenting on it, saying maybe that shouldn't have been a penalty on Ohio State. And then they get to this, and it ends up being a big momentum swinger, and they just kind of, move on from it. Again, I don't want to dwell on that too much. I did want to share my thoughts on that specifically because it is just kind of baffling how important it ended up being, but maybe wasn't realized at the time, the importance of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that entirely, changed any sort of potential momentum in that game and flipped that entirely to Ohio State. And like you said, I mean, they absolutely glossed over everything to do with that call. And I think a lot of Indiana fans were extremely confused. Did you ever go back and actually rewatch that?
I did, yeah, because
Yeah.
he definitely did not move.
No,
And
he moved also after whoever the defensive lineman there for Ohio State
yeah,
jumped and knocked over into the
to
IU
Mike
side,
Koenig, I
and
believe,
that's
yeah.
yeah. Was it Katic?
Because
Okay,
that
I
would have
wasn't sure if
been
it
the
was
first
yeah.
down Indiana, and then when
Yeah,
you
it was
have
third. It
it
was
being a
third and
false
3, I
start,
think. Yeah.
it's when Curtis Rourke gets sacked. It's
Yep.
completely different stuff, and we'll move on from there. I don't want to make it sound like we're just going to bitch about the officials the entire time because we're not.
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
was still very egregious.
Yeah, and outside of that, the major just eye popping number for me was let's take away the two possessions that ended in the touchdowns. The very first possession, and then pretty much that last possession. Outside of that, they had 31 plays for 28 total yards, and that is just obviously inexcusable as any team that you're trying to compete in a top 5 matchup, but also for Indiana, that just for a team that has been able to move the ball at will and pretty much respond to any sort of adversity on the offensive side, that was the most concerning eye-popping number there for me, and obviously a lot of it had to do with that offensive line production and that inability to get any sort of pass protection, and obviously some of those drops, but I think Kurt Cignetti talked about it after the game that they just did not respond to it, any sort of adversity well, pretty much from halftime on. And then they just were, I think, a little bit probably the first time all year that we saw this team just caught up in the moment a little bit too much. And it just seemed, I don't want to say that the moment was too big, because I truly think that this team is still a very, very good football team and definitely deserving of a spot in the college football playoff. But they've just never been in that type
Yeah.
of moment before. And I think it was before the game. I think it was Nick Saban talking about it, or maybe even Ryan Day as well when he was on College Game Day. But, Ohio State specifically, right? Always in these top 5 matchups, top 2
Yeah.
matchups, top 10 matchups, and always late in the season, right? Whether it's Big Ten championships, whether it's the Ohio State Michigan game that always caps off the season, right? If it's a Penn State game that they're always playing in, obviously they had the Oregon game earlier this year. They are, as much as you probably don't want to say it from an Indiana's perspective, they are just way more built for that type of moment at this point. Not to say that Indiana can't get there, and probably will eventually if the success continues at this level that we've seen. But that was the first time I think you really look at this team and say, okay, specifically for this group, this was probably the one time that they were just way overmatched because of that specific moment.
This was your welcome to the big leagues moment for
Yeah.
Indiana football. And as long as Kurt Cignetti's able to continue to, do what he's done so far with Indiana in year one, they will get used to playing in environments like
Yep.
this more often. And one thing you hope you don't become is Penn State, because again, they've been in that upper echelon of the Big Ten for some time now, but they've struggled in these games. I don't know what James Franklin's record against top competition is, but it's not good. It's not good at all. I mean, Penn State, again, they take care of business outside of that. So, it kind of balances itself out. But that was Indiana's first taste of trying to get to that. Kurt Cignetti mentions emerging superpower. Well, to get to that full superpower status, you have to beat some of those teams eventually. And again, he's 0 for 1, and there's nothing shameful about losing to Ohio State on the road, especially an Ohio State team. Yeah, especially an Ohio State team that is more than likely one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the country this year. And, I'm just happy to say that this team is still likely going to be in the college football playoff. And we can wrap up with this. The SEC teams that were aspiring playoff teams, Alec, they did Indiana a whole lot of favors last night. And that includes an Alabama loss to Oklahoma, a Florida win against Ole Miss, or I should say an Ole Miss loss to Florida if I'm, using the same format of my wording, right? And then Auburn defeating Texas A&M in quadruple overtime. Not to mention a couple of Big 12 upsets, Arizona State beating BYU and Kansas knocking off number 16 Colorado. So chaos aplenty in college football last night, and I don't really think Indiana fans should have any reason to think they won't be included in this week's top 12.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you look at all those, and right, the one difference is outside, I think it was, the BYU Arizona State game, right? All those other teams that lost were to unranked opponents and to opponents with maybe 5 wins. I think I don't think any one of those had over 5. So you look at the vastly different type of loss, and obviously Alabama got absolutely manhandled in that game. I think that pretty much cements their season here. Especially when it comes to the college football playoff. I think there's probably still going to be some gripe around Ole Miss because they obviously kept that a lot closer when you kind of compare that Ole Miss and Alabama resume right now. But outside of that, it was probably the best day that you could have had from an Indiana perspective when it comes to the rankings and the projections. Obviously, all they had to do was win, and there was no discussion whatsoever. But there's a reason why there's not a ton of undefeated teams that go through college football every single year. So you're probably going to slip up once. They did, but that loss is much better than any of these other losses. And now teams that have 3 losses that were kind of in that same conversation to get in. I'm still a little bit hesitant because I still think there's probably going to be some SEC brand bias because there always has, there always will. But I think you can clearly look at this Indiana path, and again, assuming that they win against Purdue next weekend, they have to be in at this point because of everything that happened yesterday, and because of, again, they've beaten everyone, not only beaten everyone that they're supposed to, but absolutely manhandled everyone that they've faced. And they've looked great doing it, and they don't have that really bad loss that all these other teams do now. So I think you look at Indiana's resume, and from that perspective, I think you have to be very happy. Obviously, what happened yesterday.
And I'll say this: I know that there's been a lot of brand bias nationally, at least from the pundits, the talking heads, but I don't get the sense that the committee themselves undervalues Indiana the way that it seems like the people that talk about the rankings do, right? Because we have the ranking show, and then the rankings, the people who do the ranking show and the committee are 2 separate entities. I think sometimes it's easy to get those confused and think they're one and the same, and they're not. Because during those ranking shows, especially the last couple of weeks, it feels like all they do is bitch and gripe about Indiana, which is very odd if we're being honest. And where we've seen them place Indiana at number 5, especially before this week, whenever they had a bye, and they didn't drop them in any way, shape, or form based on results from teams that were behind them. I think it does show that they value what Indiana has done, and they clearly value Ohio State as well. They know Ohio State's a really good team. I don't anticipate Indiana dropping any lower than 10 this Tuesday. Maybe that's wishful thinking to some people, but based on the results that we mentioned earlier, I think Indiana will still comfortably be sitting at 10, maybe even better, depending on, again, how much they actually value this Indiana team.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Obviously, this is going to be the one ranking show that not only is going to decide a lot for Indiana, right? Because they don't have that extra game unless things really fall apart here next week in terms of getting to the Big Ten championship, and they don't have that notable season finale against a team that they could move up with the win, based off of that. So it's going to be interesting to see where they fall, because I think they just don't have a lot of other room to get up in the rankings and rise there after that Purdue game. And they're going to have to kind of sit back and watch everything unfold, which I think is probably going to be extremely nerve-wracking for a guy like Kurt Cignetti, who always wants to be in control of things and be in kind of control of his own destiny there. But I do think that the committee does absolutely value, again, the full body of work. Multiple different metrics, right? It's not just strength of schedule that a lot of people obviously continue to point at for Indiana.
And speaking of that, I don't know if you noticed this, Alec, but because of them playing Ohio State yesterday, their strength of schedule jumped up to 51 or something like that. So it's not even, I mean, it's still kind of relevant, but at the same time, it's they finally played that marquee opponent. It was just so late in the season. Everything kind of evens out, it seems like, at least a little bit.
Yeah, like it always does, right? I mean, you obviously see the SEC teams with a lot of other, out of conference matchups, right? The Georgia UMass game yesterday, that I think the committee looks at, especially playing at this point of year of the season, and kind of undervalues some of those as well. But all in all, I mean, I think we talked about it yesterday too, John. That right around that 10 mark is probably where you're going to see Indiana, and I think that's feasible. I think that's also deserving. But it will be now very interesting to see how much of that full body of work is actually taken into account, because this was the one measuring stick that Indiana had, and it wasn't a great performance. I think it was a very good first half. So I think you look at that and you have to be, from a committee's perspective, and look at kind of how that game played out. And I think that score is a lot different than maybe, what the game actually felt like, because it did feel at times a lot closer, where one or two plays could have sparked any sort of momentum, and obviously that didn't happen. So you can't fully play that hypothetical game, but it just seemed at times it was a lot closer than what that score obviously indicated at the end of the day.
We'll get the chance next week to see how a Cignetti team at Indiana for the first time will respond to a loss. So we'll get that, with Indiana Purdue next Saturday, and hopefully we're talking about 11-1 and college football playoff stuff. It's still exciting times for Indiana football, and I've enjoyed this ride, and hopefully it continues. So this has been a morning after edition. Alec, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Since we didn't get one out after the game yesterday.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's better. So we had some time to kind of see how things did play out, and that was one of the reasons why we kind of talked about it, just because there was a lot that could have happened yesterday. And like we said, obviously a lot went in Indiana's favor regardless of that result. So I wanted to see kind of how everything played out before we jumped on and started talking about what was obviously a massive game for Indiana, and a disappointing result. But all things considered, I think, like we said,
level heads always prevail, right?
Sometimes.
All right, until then, we'll have In Touch with Indiana Sports tomorrow. Mitchell Page should be joining me as usual to give his thoughts on everything that went down. And then we have a big basketball week coming up with the Battle for Atlanta. So a lot of good stuff to talk about. Be sure to check out everything going on at HoosierIllustrated.com and the YouTube channel as well, Hoosier Illustrated. And until then, this has been another edition of the Indiana Football Postgame Wrap-Up Show on HoosierIllustrated.com.